But now it's my turn.
Hey, no shoving!
Then stay out of my way.
Kagura! Damn it! This is what happens when you try to show off like that. You know I have no obligation to save you, right? Screw it! No more, please. What? What's going on? That should have healed you.
What's happened? My body is tearing apart.
Kagura!
I sure as hell ain't gonna die in a place like...
Hello everybody and welcome to this video. We are talking about Grindhouse this time around, and specifically with regards to Onechanbara. Now, the video footage that you're seeing in front of you is of Onechanbara Z2 Chaos, which was released way back in 2014, so it is by no means a new title. But what inspired me to make this video is that we've seen some footage and details emerge this week regarding the remake of the very first game in the series, Onechanbara, which is called Onechanbara Origin, which is in development for PlayStation 4 at the moment, and will hopefully get a worldwide release later on. It's coming out in Japan this year, but we haven't got a confirmation about a localization at this stage. Fingers crossed. Now, the reason I'm doing this video is, like I said at the start, to talk about Grindhouse, because it's very easy to look at a game like Onechanbara and just immediately dismiss it because it's bikini girls and school uniforms and zombies and gore, and it's all very trashy, and that's kind of the point. And it's easy to dismiss it on that basis, but there's actually a lot of heritage in the Grindhouse genre. So I wanted to talk about that for a moment because it is an area of particular interest to me. I have spent a lot of time over the years studying Grindhouse cinema. I actually did it as a major part of my university course when I did undergraduate in film studies and whatever. And yeah, it's something that's really interested me, so I wanted to take this opportunity to talk about where Onechanbara kind of sits in that heritage. And actually, it's a very good example of the Grindhouse. It does a great job of being a homage to Grindhouse, and I think anybody that has an interest in that kind of B-grade filmmaking history will find this one quite interesting as well. So, what is Grindhouse? These days we see Grindhouse as being basically equivalent to B-grade horror films. The kind of films that are really violent, generally have some kind of stalker, Jason Voorhees or whatever, and generally involve some kind of element of sexuality as well. Generally a woman gets her boobs out at some point, and we classify that, or we talk about that in terms of Grindhouse, but that's really not what Grindhouse was. Originally, Grindhouse was basically a way of talking about a very kind of specific type of film that was really popular through the 20s, 30s and 40s, and it was a little bit off Hollywood. These films were basically sexploitation films. The cinemas that would play them were next to burlesque bars and kind of the red light areas within towns and cities, and people would go for that kind of particular entertainment. Now, Grindhouse kind of had three defining characteristics that critics of the time would talk about them in terms of. So they were cheap, for one thing. They were really, really cheap to get into. It was really kind of very low class, entertainment as such. So the ticket prices were very inexpensive. The films were churned out very quickly, and that also includes the cinemas themselves would churn through the films very quickly. So they tended to be shorter films, and it was the point was you would possibly watch a couple in a row, but the sequence, they would not stop playing really. It'd be an endless reel of films, and there'd be new films constantly coming out. So it was a very kind of factory line style approach to making films. The third point was that they were of very low quality and minimal artistic merit, and that kind of goes without saying. That still applies today when we talk about Grindhouse films. We're talking about the very B-grade, C-grade, Z-grade. We're talking about the lowest quality films. The films that are really there because they're very crass entertainment. They involve the sex, the sexploitation, they involve the extreme violence, and that is what kind of the core of Grindhouse is you're not meant to take them seriously as films. They're certainly not artistically brilliant, but they are entertaining and stupid, and that's why people enjoyed them. They enjoyed them because they were just utter nonsense and a little bit of cheap fun. It was the advent of television that really killed Grindhouse as a genre. Once you were able to move all of that material onto VHS tapes and DVDs and whatever, the desire to have the cinema experience kind of dissipated very quickly, and it is a dead genre now. There are elements of what Grindhouse was about, which persisted on through the 60s, 70s, right up to today. B-tier horror, for example, is a very good example of what a modern evolution of Grindhouse might look like. But for all intents and purposes, what Grindhouse was back when it was still the kind of the popular thing, that is gone. That just doesn't exist anymore. But that's not to say it wasn't influential for a lot of people. And a lot of filmmakers really celebrate the kind of aesthetic that Grindhouse represented, and the nonsense and the sense of fun that you can go about watching these films, because you're not meant to take them seriously. They don't have artistic merit, remember. They're just silly nonsense. And there is a certain appeal in that, and it's always been there, and some of the greatest filmmakers in the world are quite inspired by it. Robert Rodriguez, for example, is very much inspired by Grindhouse. Quentin Tarantino is another great example of a filmmaker who's very inspired by Grindhouse, and elements of that stuff actually makes its way into his films. In fact, Robert Rodriguez and Quentin Tarantino teamed up to make a kind of special Grindhouse experience for cinema, in which it was 2 very short films with a couple of trailers for other fake Grindhouse films made by horror artists like Eli Roth thrown in there, and you'd go in and you'd watch it over a couple of hours, and you'd get 2 films, a couple of fake trailers, and that was the kind of homage to that glory days of the Grindhouse genre. But for most, for all intents and purposes, it is a dead genre, and it is just something that certain people are inspired to by and create homages to. Grindhouse has also gone on to inspire a number of video game makers, probably those people who snuck in and watched some of them when they were younger, for example, or caught up with them when they started to take their film and arts studies seriously. Before we even start to talk about Onechanbara, which we will do, and a great example of it is Goichi Suda. Most of Goichi Suda's films have some kind of Grindhouse element in them. Some of them are explicitly Grindhouse, like Shadows of the Damned and Lollipop Chainsaw, both very explicitly Grindhouse experiences. But there are other examples as well. Sega's House of the Dead series is very clearly Grindhouse inspired, and there are plenty of other ones. Red Dead Revolver, the Western genre and Grindhouse went together quite frequently, so that game was a bit of an, was inspired by it. And there have been some other ones as well. But for this video, I wanted to quickly talk about Onechanbara because it is a great example of everything that is great about Grindhouse. It is extremely violent. The blood that you're seeing on the screen there, that goes everywhere, and it's way over the top, and it fills the screen, and it fills your eyeballs with an endless spray of crimson. I can't actually play these games for too long because they are just that kind of overload of aesthetic, which makes it hard to watch for long periods of time, as much as I do love them. I play them in short bursts, so it's just as well that they're actually fairly short games as well, actually. But on top of the violence, there is obviously the sex side as well. It's a very sexualized game. The 2 main characters are in bikinis, the other 2 main characters are school uniforms, and there is every opportunity to undress them further. The developers take the super powered up mode is even less clothinged than the bikinis, and this DLC included fruit. Funnily enough, there was a DLC pack where you would you'd have a couple of pieces of fruit strategically placed, and that was the entirety of their costume. So that kind of sexploitation side of things is definitely present in Onechanbara as well. It's one of the reasons that a lot of people dismiss it. But it really goes to the aesthetic, and it makes for a more authentic homage to the Grindhouse genre. And I think that this is a very authentically Grindhouse kind of game. So I think the developers have absolutely nailed this series. This series is a brilliant execution on what the plan was. And it's actually led to a film as well. There's an Onechanbara film, which I haven't actually had a chance to see, but I can imagine that it would also be very authentically Grindhouse, which would be good. I should check it out at some point. What's interesting about these games is the tension I think that the developers must find about making the games play well. because the point of Grindhouse is that it is poorly produced. The camera work was always dodgy in Grindhouse films. The acting performances were generally terrible. The cinematography was poor. The set design was poor. Costumes were cheap as anything, if they were wearing costumes at all. So that side of things, the whole point of Grindhouse is it is meant to be bad. But of course in video games we have this expectation that elements of it are good. So if the camera is dodgy in a video game, then all of a sudden that becomes a problem for playing it. Or if the action is dodgy, or if there are bugs, or all of those kinds of things, that makes it very hard to create something I think that is authentically Grindhouse, because the bad is meant to be there, but the developers feel this tension to make something really playable and clean. And I think if the game was as clean as, say, a Bayonetta or a Devil May Cry, it would actually lose some of that authenticity as a Grindhouse game. And that's really difficult as a critic to sit here to talk about it. On the one hand, I'm saying that 90% of the time I want my video games to be as good as possible. I want them to play as well as possible. I want them to be clean, and I want them to be a very good experience. But when it gets to something like a Grindhouse game, I think that I do want something that has that raw element to it, that has a slightly unproduced element to it. I want to not struggle with the camera to the point where I can't play with it, but I want to have that element where it's not quite as refined as a proper video game, because I want it to maintain that Grindhouse atmosphere. Now, in saying that, I don't think Onechanbara does it perfectly well. I think it is a little bit too difficult in terms of it's a little bit too unproduced, and I think it's a lesser series as a result of that. If I look at something like Lollipop Chainsaw, I think Lollipop Chainsaw actually did it really well, and Goichi Suda managed to produce a game which had the raw element to it, which had that kind of Grindhouse energy, which had that cheap production look, but at the same time making a game that was very playable and very enjoyable. I think Onechanbara is a much more B-tier video game than that, and I think that you need to be able to put up with it being poor in a lot of ways in order to enjoy it, but I think the authenticity, the Grindhouse atmosphere and spirit is just so good that I can't wait for Origin to get an English release. I really hope it does get one. Okay, thanks very much for watching this video. I hope it was interesting. I do love my Grindhouse, as you can probably tell. And yeah, do let me know what your thoughts are about Onechanbara and other Grindhouse games, and we will see you at the next video.